everyone, and welcome to another edition of the Founders and Leaders series. And I'm really delighted to be joined by Ange Taylor today, who is CEO and founder of AddMaple. Ange, hello, welcome to the show.
I am so excited. You are a guru in our industry, so thank you for having me on, Mike.
Very kind, but it's great. It's really great to have you. Where are you joining from? Are you at home? Where are you?
I'm from yet again another office. I've moved again. I'm from my office in Ljubljana, which many people cannot pronounce. Ljubljana, Slovenia.
Okay, wonderful. Before we get into this, how did you end up being based there before we get into AddMaple and everything else? Obviously, you're not originally a native of Slovenia.
So, this idea of AddMaple was kind of bubbling over for quite a long time. And when the time came when I was ready to start putting together, ideas, prototype and so forth, I started thinking, not just what you want to build, but where do you want to build? How can I juggle being a founder, being a mom? That was before I became a carer to my brothers. And so I was looking across Europe for options that are nice and close to the UK to stay in touch. But, my social life wouldn't have allowed me to build AddMaple. That's the truth. I decided, you know what, guys, I'm just going to, nip off abroad so that I could really focus on the kids still, but really build this startup and solve complex problems. So Slovenia won. I looked at some other European countries, but Slovenia it's well built. The infrastructure is fantastic, great broadband access, fast road. It just works. And in terms of building a business, it's just a really good, solid base because life around, all the little things that you need to function around your day-to-day life, that works really well. So yeah, I'm still here and love it. Absolutely love it.
It's a beautiful part of the world. I know we have a very diffuse global audience. I'm sure we're sending people scrabbling to Google Maps now to try and find Ljubljana on the map, but it's an amazing city. And if anyone actually has the opportunity to visit, do, because, fabulous places to go and see, like Bled, some of the most beautiful scenery in Europe. So yeah, lovely place to be. Now, Ange, AddMaple. So tell us a little bit about, what was your journey that led you to build the business? And then, what does it do? Who for? How does it add value for them?
It started with me working as a user researcher. And I was that person that really wanted to put the user at the heart of product development, business decisions, really took my discipline seriously. But I was constantly up against different types of data that I had to deal with, not just what the users did in the product, but survey data and other bits of feedback. So it was really difficult for me to use the various bits of data that we had about customers to then inform other bits of the business. So that's kind of where I started off with a lot of frustration. And that's where the dream started for me to, I thought, well, how hard can it be to just taking different types of data and let someone like me explore it visually? How hard can that be? So yeah, that's where I started. I started off, using SPSS and getting just being frustrated that when I delivered the insight that I'd worked so hard to get to, and the slide might not look that cool, the chart might not look great, but it took me such a long time that the decision felt like it had already left the building. It felt like I was constantly chasing decisions that were busy being made, trying to find data to be data-led, but it just felt like I was having an uphill battle. So that's how I started.
So you, and I'm going to upset a lot of people by saying this, but you sound like you're in a fairly sort of small overlap in the Venn diagram, which is user UX researchers are often quite allergic to quant data. They tend to be much more, qualitative. So, you say you're working with, different types of analytics and survey data. So you sort of blended that with the qualitative and the observations and, the different types of inputs you had for UX research. Is that right?
Yes, because, I realized I needed to do that in order to understand a different slice. Yes, I loved my in-depth interviews, but also, I wanted to see, well, where are people landing in the product? Where are they going? Where are they dropping off? So all those SAM key flows. And then also when we're trying to migrate users from one plan to another, when I was working in fintech, I needed, the the SQL database to be, dumped so that I could work out who these people are. So I suppose I did, but it wasn't because I necessarily loved data. It was because I needed to understand the data to understand the people. And I think that's kind of what drove me and still drives me now. It's not that I, fall asleep thinking of all data, but it's because I want to use the data to understand the people that matter. Yeah.
Great. So the spark was, I need to understand this data. SPSS is frustrating. By the time I've answered the question, the train's left the station, sort of thing. So what did you build with AddMaple, and how is it different, and how is it evolving, I guess?
So AddMaple is a visual-first data exploration tool whereby you connect raw data, survey data, for example, and it immediately detects the different data types within that data set by column and gives you summaries in the form of charts and tables so that you can begin exploring in a visual interface. And I think that's quite important, is that it's a visual-first interface. So from there, you can then click or search for a variable and then click on a bar on the chart to filter down. For example, if you've got countries, you see all your countries by frequency order, but then you can say, oh, I'm interested in Slovenia. Click on the bar and it will then filter down the whole data set, not just that chart, but the whole dashboard with all questions by that. Then you can add in dates. So it's an exploration tool, which is, even I'm starting to understand, it's much more of an exploration tool than it is per se data analysis in the traditional sense. And you can filter by how people answered one question and then see how that subgroup answered every other question. So it's very much like relational exploration with different types of data that you would typically have in a survey, multi-select, choose all that apply, that kind of thing.
That's interesting. So I wonder how much of the framing of this actually was because you had a slightly unconventional perspective, coming from UX research. Obviously, a lot of survey research is built by survey researchers who don't necessarily have that background. But you're talking about the need to be able to visualize, to be able to sort of drag and drop and see things in a much more intuitive way. Where did the brand name come from? Can I ask? AddMaple. What does it mean, and where does it come from?
So at the time when I was naming my product, so I was looking at, modeling tools, what mathematical modeling tools are there? So there's MapleSoft, which is a Canadian company. That's great because they let you also play with different mathematical concepts, quite visual. And then at the time, my friend had a puppy named Maple, and I thought, this is a sign. I'm gonna just, what can I do? What can I add in front of Maple? ADD Maple, done, job done. And that's just how it started. I had 2 points, 2 data points, and thought, that's it.
Excellent. What a brilliant origin story that, you can just come up with a new brand name like that. And it is distinctive. People know when they mention it. Obviously, I see pink. Is it still pink, or has that
Still
moved on,
pink.
the identity?
Absolutely. It's still pink in the sea of blue. Data tools.
So who's been the main users as you've been building this, developing it, getting kind of feedback, product market fit? Who has really taken to this? Is it people coming from the market research background, the UX side of things, the analytics? Because I gather you can work with different types of data now as well.
I think the core of my base, right from the beginning, was actually market researchers. Not, as you say, UX researchers tend to, as you rightly pointed out, answer, not all of them deal with surveys, but market researchers form the bulk. And interestingly, in in-house teams, it's the market research team that would typically reach out and say, could you help with the tracker study? And then from there, they would say, oh, so you could help with this and that other type of data set. But that's very much the path. So market research and, insight platforms, you are very much serving this segment. So yeah, it is the heart of the business, even though it can do other types of data. I think because they experience that pain more than perhaps other types of users. So yeah, market research.
Okay. And we were talking just before we went live about, sort of the pivots, the sort of sequence of small pivots that you make in the early stages. So how have things changed, and what, I guess, what kind of new capabilities, or how have you evolved the product since you launched? Because you're fully bootstrapped, is that right?
Fully bootstrapped. And Mike, you've been there kind of in the wings from the start, which you might not even realize, because V1, when we released just the survey, a lot of automation, you were there, you popped in. And then I remember when we added our data, text analysis module, where you could analyze text with AI, and then sentiment, you were there. So yeah, thanks for being part of the journey. But where we are essentially now, I guess it's a natural progression, where it's just solving, I suppose, that initial need that I had, which was, I want to understand the people in my business, and these people give feedback in different ways. So we've gone from solving surveys, which are complex and nightmarish, to now being able to put in the different data sources that matter to you. So online reviews you clean and analyze, customer support tickets, on social media. Essentially, if people that matter to you leave feedback in a different place or in a different format, including BigQuery, data lakes, you can pull that into an exploration layer and begin to understand what they are saying, how they're scoring, how the themes relate to the various scores, to understand the why behind churn data, or behind NPS scores or CSAT metrics. So that's very much where we are, to try and empower insight teams to focus as an intelligence unit within the business, to be able to say to product, okay, these are the bugs that are coming up a lot within the churn survey, framework. These are the things that people are mentioning online about our competitors. These are the new opportunities that we need to be aware of, where our competitors have moved. These are the things that people think they're buying because of the marketing messages that we've sent out. But when they land in the product, this is where the gap is between promise and delivery. So that kind of, analysis, regardless of data source and data type, becomes, within the insight team is where we're at now.
Interesting, of different types of data in there, because obviously we see, insight platforms, we see hundreds, actually a couple of thousand different solutions across this broader space. Most are within specific categories. So they may be within, review analytics or feedback analytics that includes reviews and NPS feedback, survey analysis and charting, or data analytics that doesn't really understand survey data. So, so I guess it's back to where we started about the user research perspective, but also with analytics type data plus surveys. There's a solution here that kind of pulls those things more together into one place. Is that a fair summary of what you've described?
Yeah, exactly. It's a solution to help the people who need to understand the people in the business, to understand through data, whether they are data people or not. So, and it's got that stats testing in the background, so that all their findings are statistically tested throughout. So as soon as you code, for example, open end in a survey, or code the comments in, a tranche of 1,500 reviews, the stats engine will show you, okay, these themes are linked to these scores. So even though you might not have had time to manually run the test, determine the pair of tests, and then go and do it in SPSS, you also have the stats layer that's automatically and dynamically showing you patterns, so that you can understand what people are saying, but have it tested statistically. And then you can quickly get those insights out to the various departments in a way that you can recreate and reproduce. And yes, we have AI as a layer on top, but it doesn't run calculations. You are able to reproduce and trace back your findings so that you have confidence when you're saying, hey, product, this is important, or marketing or sales or so forth.
Okay. I think that's going to be a record, because we're about 15 minutes in and it's the first time that AI has been mentioned. So, who knows, maybe we're moving past it and it's just not such new news anymore, but it's interesting. So I like this convergence or multiple types of data being brought together. And actually, in a couple of weeks' time, I'll be moderating a panel about why is it that UX research sits over here in an organization and market research sits over here, and surely it's time that these things came together. I never really understood why there was so much deep division. But you talk about from a product perspective, bringing these things together. What if we just step back and look more broadly across the industry then? So some of the trends that you see that are happening, do you think there's more appetite there for people to work with different types of data? Do you think these things are starting to converge more broadly in the market?
I don't know if people realize there's appetite quite yet. The individual contributors who run the research, whether it's UX, whether it's marketing, whether it's market research, the different people who need to rely on information to make decisions. I don't know if they realize how valuable it is. I see this side of things where when a business begins to understand that, gosh, these people are able to digest and, mine different data sources to help us make better decisions, it's extremely valuable. But I find people are not so comfortable. I want to say to them, there are tools that can help you be comfortable in analyzing data, even interview transcripts that you might not normally have been comfortable with, because we can't just rely on a single view to make good decisions. We need to be able to triangulate, and we need to be able to consider the full picture of the target audience that we're trying to use. So I think there's a huge appetite, but I don't think the market researchers, the user research, I don't think they're aware of the need for this.
Yeah, I think there's so many different types of data, information, input that you can use. I think maybe we've over segregated a little bit as an industry. We've over specialized, perhaps, where there's scope to be much more integrated. What are some of the other trends that you see happening, either with your customers or with your team, or looking at other solutions that are maybe adjacent to yours? How do you think the industry is changing?
I think the industry broadly is changing, whereby AI chat is increasingly, taking over, where people just want to, in a ChatGPT type, Claude, that kind of thing, where they want to ask questions and speak to an AI interface. So I think that's definitely taking over. When I look at products and that I use, that's very much becoming prevalent. I mean, I'm obviously, from the research point of view, very much concerned that we don't still value a solid user interface. So I personally get a bit frustrated that it feels to me that products are split down the middle, where you have an AI interface that you can type on, and then you have an interface that's completely disconnected. And I'm not so satisfied with this. I don't really, I'm not a fan of this, but I think eventually we'll marry the two again. I mean, we are marrying the two from the start, because I don't think that this is the end of the user interface. But then again, look at the background. This is obviously coming from someone that, who knows what I know, but I definitely think there's value in combining the two, having the AI be able to operate the user interface. So it's one experience, one joined up experience. I mean, that's just my view.
Yeah, well, you're right. I think most of the tools that I've seen, you'll go into a separate part of the application to be able to have that conversational analysis, and it doesn't connect with the traditional GUI where you point and click, or you're generating charts or whatever. It's very hard to integrate. There are some honorable exceptions. I'm not going to talk about other companies right now, but there are some really great examples out there. But they are in the minority, I think, where it's a much more unified sense of how do you get that talk to data alongside your established ways of doing dashboards and so on. Yeah.
The consequence of not marrying them up is that the AI will give you an output, an answer that you can't then edit. So if it generates a chart for you, you can't relabel it. You can't, you either use what it gives you, or you have to, go into prompt ping pong backwards and forwards to try and get it to. So yeah. especially with data, maybe it's because of this, of our industry. Maybe that's why, maybe if we were in a different industry, it wouldn't might matter as much. But I think in our industry, you want to be able to edit the chart it gives you, or edit the pivot, or switch the pivot, the columns and the rows. And yeah.
There's an analogy here with the world, of coding. So obviously, Claude Code, Codex, these tools have massively compressed the amount of time that it takes to generate code. But what the feedback seems to be now from an awful lot of team leaders and product managers is the time spent validating, verifying, querying and refining actually is almost as long, if not longer, than had the code been generated, using the kind of established methods anyway. Do you think there's a risk here as well that, what you do is you generate something with a chat AI, it gives you an answer, you're not sure, you have to verify, you go back and forth, like you say, the prompt ping pong. Is it actually saving time in the long run? I mean, where do you see people's behavior on that?
I agree with you, because it doesn't necessarily then save time, and you lose confidence. Because ultimately, if we just go back to first principles, as insights professionals, what is our job? Our job is to take a business question, weigh up the various business questions according to urgency and risk, then go do research, and then get an insight back. And if we're working with an interface where we can't work backwards from, this is what the AI is telling me is correct, and I can't work backwards, that means I'm unable to give a confident recommendation to whoever is needing my insight. And therefore, you don't know where to begin to question, so what is correct? And you might as well then just start from scratch. So yeah, I think it's a time risk, and it's a confidence risk, especially if you cannot reproduce the same results. So that's why in AddMaple, our AI tools do not do any calculations at all. They sit on top of a stats engine, and the stats engine does all the calculations, and then it sits on top of a chart engine. It doesn't even generate charts, but it can trigger key driver analysis, clustering, different types of statistical tests depending on the data type it's looking at, but it is unable to actually do any analysis. It's just that interpretation layer on top, because we want that every single time you load the same data set that you get the same output. The AI might interpret it slightly differently, answer your question slightly differently, but the answer is still the same, right down to the count value. So the confidence, and you can get those insights out.
Yeah, this is the central tension, isn't it, between the having AI as the sort of umbrella label. You've got things you really need to be run deterministically, like you say, consistency every time. And then, the generative side of things may be great for some of the interpretative summary writing, whatever, but, making sure that you're being clear about how you're using each of those, and you're not having expectations of deterministic output from a generative solution. Yeah. What do you think is, or is there, we talked about the talk to data, conversational AI, some of this, merging of different capabilities, data types. Is there a trend that you think is overhyped right now in the insights industry, technology type space? Are there things that, people are getting very excited about that you're thinking, I'm not so sure?
Well, I say this with but I think I should be honest, right? But yeah, I'm very skeptical about the use case of using synthetic data to mimic human responses. Bearing in mind that I come from user research, yes, there's that. So I do have that bias where I always want to ideally do in-person research. And I know that it's not always, realistic, but I feel that it's still a form of black box. We have panel fraud, and we have lots of, things that get between the business question, the business answer that we can't trace back. And I feel like using synthetic data that is generative, that is based on something that you might not be able to reproduce, I feel like it is a hype in our industry that I'm not entirely comfortable with, because we're not spending the necessary energy to solve the underlying problem, which is who are the people completing our surveys? How can we be confident that we're asking the right questions to the right people in a time frame to inform the right decisions? So, yeah.
Okay, fair challenge. So not convinced that you can get an effective like for like on synthetic or personas. Do you think there's a world where it's good enough for certain types of decision, or it's okay at certain points in the process? We're not talking about substituting. We're talking about a different type of decision.
Exactly. I use synthetic personas in my own workflow, but I treat it as differently. I'm not trying to make that false equivalence that it is answering as a human, because naturally we are asking, I hope, a new business question. I hope that, and when we're asking a new business question, I want to be able to check with the humans because opinions shift. But there is a use case, running ideas, ideation, it's fantastic. And critiquing, I use it all the time. So I do have synthetic personas that I use as that first pass, but not necessarily to do research with. It's kind of different. It's like a sparring partner. Where are the gaps in my thinking? As opposed to research that I can then verify statistically and so on and so forth. So I think that's the tension for me still.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. Absolutely. So, we talked about synthetic data potentially being slightly overhyped, or, obviously it's early stages. Are there any trends that you think people are underestimating? Are there things that you think are big that people are not really making as much fun about?
I think maybe it's once again, that user interface. I think for me, beautiful user interfaces, we see less of that being written about, less of that being emphasized. UX researchers, UX designers, you see the job market shifting with, or there's conflicting data, but I think it's fair to say that UX hasn't had the easiest time of late. So I definitely think the value of a solid user interface, then powered by AI, of course, with some connectivity. But yeah, that for me is at the moment undervalued. And I'm hoping that we'll see in the future where there's a shift back with AI plus, a user interface where they're joined up. Yeah. So that for me.
Okay. No, that's good. That's reassuring. I'm also incredibly shallow when it comes to, to UI, and people will often expect me to know far more about the solutions that we have on the website, on Insight platforms, much more detail about functionality. And, my response often is, it's kind of ugly, or actually it's really pretty, kind of compelling, to use, because that's the kind of level at which I engage. But, that's what has catapulted some businesses to being, multi-billion-dollar organizations by, focus on the UI, focus on that experience that actually helps people get things done. So, yeah, I'd agree. I think we have a legacy. It's improved a lot in recent years, but in the research and insights world, we have a legacy of terrible design with very rich functionality, under the surface. You talked about SPSS to start with, perfect case in point, incredibly challenging interface, incredibly powerful, analytics capabilities. Yeah.
Yep.
Okay, good. So what do you think will be different, I guess, in, 2 or 3 years' time? What might still be the same? I love you saying, it's your preferences for face-to-face interviews and contact, with the human side of things. How do you see that changing, or how do you see the inside industry, the research and data world changing in the next 2 or 3 years?
I think synthetic data is going to become the norm. I think, we're going to go through, the cycle where synthetic data is where business leaders might say, well, let's, skip all this, expensive research with panels and so forth. Let's do the, and then I'm hoping that we'll learn from perhaps the outcomes, that there is always a need for research with humans. And then I hope that we will finally tackle the real problem. So I think in 3 years' time, we would have realized that human input, research with humans, and that panels will finally be of better quality, and business leaders will be able to pay the right amount for the right quality, but I think we first need to through, a cycle. That's what I think will happen.
Hey, you think we need to go? I mean, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but you think we need to have something crash and burn and be an absolute disaster to make people realize, the value of real human input? Is that what you're hoping for?
No, not hoping, but I think that's what's happening. I think we need, a few more, wrong predictions, yeah, and then we'll say, okay, well, actually, let's go back to the, basics, yeah. Let's look at, well, was this a randomized sample? Was this representative of the population? Going back to the basics, yeah. But first, we're on this hype train, and I'm just observing from the outside.
We need to move through the cycle and learn the lessons that are inevitably going to come. Okay, fair enough. So talking about lessons, you're a bootstrap founder. I am as well. It's an incredibly, let's say, roller coaster journey. When it's all on you. Can you share some of the things that you've learned over the last few years of building up a business from scratch and managing that? There's so many hype stories in the industry about so and so's just got $30 million in VC funding, and yet there's a very different path to be taken if you're bootstrapping, isn't there?
Yeah. Gosh, I think I never paid attention to VC rounds and that kind of thing. And then I became a founder, and I realized that people assume your product is X, Y, or Z based off of your recent round. And I didn't quite realize that this would even come into play. I thought people would just see your product, try it, and then. So definitely, maybe I would have, in hindsight, would I have gone for funding earlier? I don't. You never know, but I definitely think in our industry, perhaps when you're the only one being bootstrapped, because if I think about people on your insights platforms, I would love to know how many are bootstrapped actually. That would be quite an interesting data point. So yes, I'm still bootstrapped. I'm actually working on my deck at the moment, but how much that will take priority over the other things, I don't quite know. It's one of those things I start and then, it's tough being bootstrapped because you're juggling a few things all the time. You're juggling, what's the next opportunity that I'm going to jump on? But it does keep you super focused and close to your audience. And I'm sure it's the same for you, Mai. It keeps you listening. It keeps you, so I don't recommend it for people in our space, actually, because you actually might lose out on opportunities just by the mere fact that you're bootstrapped. I don't know, maybe that's just, I've actually edited my website, my About Us page, because I was actually leading on my About Me page that, we are bootstrapped. I was quite proud of it. But I think in our industry, when you're dealing with tier 1 logos, that's not quite the badge that you're wanting. So yeah. I think in our industry, though, what do you think, Mike? I don't think it's if you were building for our industry and you were building an insights tool, Mike, how would you approach it?
I'm a control freak and I don't like having a boss. So the idea of having an interfering, funding partner from VC or private equity is it complete anathema to me. So I'm probably not representative of how most founders in the space might think, but there's clearly a spectrum on both sides. But I think on the VC side of things, some of the amounts are quite eye-watering. Some of the statements that are made by the investors about the size of the opportunity and the nature of the disruption, I don't want to sound old, but you do get a little bit cynical about some of these things after a while. I think obviously growth capital is essential in certain situations. You can't build product and get it out to market and keep on top of it if you don't have some of that rocket fuel in the tank. There is a longer approach, but then there's a blend of how are you making money between the product or other services that wrap around it that can then kind of smooth that. So there's been some very successful stories in our industry of people who've built great businesses and exited several times having only ever bootstrapped. I think that it's harder and harder to compete when you look at some of the amounts that are being thrown in, against some of these the bigger funding rounds. So, it's a mixed bag, but, for me, it's not the right thing. I've often wondered if we could turbocharge things at Insight Platforms with a hefty injection of capital, but I've never really wanted to go down that route personally.
Yeah.
Great. Okay. So just before we kind of wrap up, great conversation. I could chat all day, but from the business side of things, if you were talking to someone else who was thinking about starting something up in this industry, in this space, is there a particular piece of advice, a lesson that you've acquired over the last few years that you would want to pass on to them?
Now I'm going to sound like a complete contradiction. I would say what matters is, even though I said that I might consider funding at some point, I would still say don't stop funding. And the reason I would say to anyone wanting to start is to develop real relationships with the audience you want to serve, because I don't think that anything is as valuable as real relationships, real understanding of the pain that they're trying to solve. I don't think that there's anything more valuable than that. So I would say the sooner you can have that direct contact with the person, their outcome, and mapping what you can create so that you can get them from, start point to end point faster. I think that is still where we should focus our attention. And then you just have to, sort out the growth path in line with that, as you say, with services, with packaging, pricing and packaging options. But yeah, I would say to anyone starting there is, much better. And then you just have to ignore the hype. Ignore the hype around you. Ignore the hype constantly, because oftentimes that's all people talk about is the round, and you just focus on your users. Or this is at least what I tell myself, just focus on my users, So that's what I would say, honestly. And maybe that's a different way of building. But it definitely is a fulfilling way of building. I'm sure it's the same for you, Mike, but you are arguably so much closer to that, user than I think you might be otherwise. But then I don't know, because I haven't walked that path. So.
It's a nice way to come full circle to wrap things up. You started talking about your origins, in user research and focusing on, the human truth, understanding the people at the heart of it. And actually, it sounds like that's what we're saying is one of the biggest lessons about building the business is stay true to that, stay focused on that human connection and understanding the people who are going to be using the product. So great. What a nice way to wrap things up. Ange, this has been a great conversation. Thank you very much for taking the time. I know how hectic things are when you're juggling so many different things, and I do appreciate you giving us the time for this. For everyone else, we have lots of other great founders and leaders lined up from all over the industry and all over the world. People who are early stage in small micro startups, people who have been at this for a couple of decades and are sitting on top of businesses with tens of millions, hundreds of millions in revenue. So all over the industry, you'll get perspectives here from successful founders and leaders like Ange and AddMaple. Thank you very much indeed for your time. I hope you'll be back at some of our events at some time in the future.
Thank you, Mike.